It's been 13 years since the 9/11 attacks. Civil war rages in Syria. Hamas and Israel are at war once again, and ISIS is making its barbaric way through the Middle East. The question on our mind is, what lessons have we learned? Here to talk to me about that today is Elan Journo. Elan is a fellow at ARI and our Director of Policy Research. I'm Steve Simpson, ARI's Director of Legal Studies. So Elan, let's start with the big question, okay? After 9/11, we destroyed the Taliban in Afghanistan. We started a long and costly war in Iraq. Are we better off today having done all that, or are we worse off?
It might sound strange since most people will point to the fact that there hasn't been another 9/11 here on US soil, but I challenge that view that we're better off. In fact, I even challenge the assumption of the question. We did not destroy the Taliban, we scattered them. And that, I think, is an indication of some of what went wrong. We have enabled the Islamist movement, of which the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are parts, to become stronger in many ways across the Middle East. And what's left untended was one of the biggest problems, which is the Iranian regime, which is, again, part of the Islamist movement. So if you add up the pieces, we spent a lot of money, we spent a lot of lives lost, and I don't think that we've positioned ourselves so that we're safer, because the enemy has grown stronger and bolder over time.
All right, so, and one example of that might be ISIS, right? This nutball group that's making its way through the Middle East or through Iraq now, beheading people. So let's jump now to the current day and just talk a little bit about that, and then we'll back up and talk about lessons learned and some other things. What's your take on ISIS? Is this just some sui generis group that came out of nowhere? Are they related to any other groups? Give us your take on it, and then we can maybe talk a little bit more about it.
So ISIS originated as one of the insurgent groups in Iraq. And they, like a lot of the insurgent groups, the ones that survived were the ones who were better at killing Americans and better at doing savagery. They went into Syria and they became stronger, and they are basically now marching to the beat of the Islamist goal, which is to create a regime based on Allah's laws on earth, which is what the Taliban did, which is what the Iranians see themselves as doing. So in that sense, they're not unique. They're basically the same part of the same enemy. Now, they originated in the insurgency, and there's a lot to say about what went wrong in the Iraqi insurgency. So I think they're not new. They're a growing threat and they're a problem, but we have to see them as part of a larger movement.
Okay, so if we are still dealing with the same movement, if things are not necessarily better than they were, there must be some lessons that we've learned, right? So give us a sense of what are the lessons you think of 9/11 and our ensuing actions in 9/11? What have we learned since then?
So I would name three lessons. One is we didn't understand the nature of the threat before 9/11, and it caught a lot of Americans by surprise, even though 9/11 was not itself the first Islamist attack against us. So what led to that was bad US policy in the decades up to 9/11 and since. When we tried to respond, we didn't conceive of the nature of the enemy or its goals properly. We danced around that. The result was we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, and we had the wrong goal, and we pursued it in the wrong way. We did not try to defeat the threat. We, in fact, made it worse, and we tried to nation build. So the response was wrong. And third, I think we don't really understand that when you go to war, the ideas you believe really matter. They shape your policy. It's a much bigger deal than people realize. They think that the problems were essentially military. We didn't have enough troops, and we lost our focus. Those might be factors, but they are dwarfed by what sets the tone and direction of our policy. And the strategy we pursued afterwards was one that was colored deeply by philosophic ideas that are pernicious.
And so let's pick up on those ideas a little bit. In your book, Winning the Unwinnable War, you make the point, and others do who write in that book, that it was conventional morality that led to 9/11 and our self-crippled response after 9/11. So elaborate on that. Tell our viewers, what are those ideas? What is the conventional morality that you're talking about, and what's the better approach?
So the conventional morality that people take for granted is that you should be selfless. Now, that sounds crazy in the context of war, because obviously most people's healthy reaction is if they come after you, you have to defend yourself. They have self-respect enough to believe in that. But when push comes to shove, they're conflicted, because a lot of people accept the ideas of altruism, of self-sacrifice as a moral idea. Now, put that in the context of trying to defend yourself. In fact, that is the doctrine that colors the views of how to conduct war, and that shaped Iraq. So take Iraq, the goal there was not to eliminate whatever threat Saddam Hussein posed. I don't think he was a significant enough threat, but let's say he was. It wasn't to defeat Saddam, it was to rebuild Iraq so that the Iraqis would be lifted out of poverty and would get elections and so-called freedom. That was to serve the Iraqis. That does not serve American interests. Our interests are served by eliminating those who want to kill us. And so both in the goal of Iraq and then in how we conducted it in the battlefield, people don't realize that the rules under which the soldiers operate are so restrictive that sometimes they cannot defend themselves, let alone eliminate the threats. And so we put our soldiers in harm's way, we tied their hands, and then we're surprised that there's an insurgency that grows fiercer and more bold, and that Iraq is a mess. Well, you have to look at the ideas shaping that policy, not the military conduct, because they're essentially following orders and doing it as valiantly as they can. But you can't win if your policy is self-sacrificial.
So you wrote about that after 9/11. ARI, I know, was talking about that even before 9/11. Is there an I told you so here?
Sadly, I think so. The theme that the Institute has been pushing is that the Islamist threat is a growing menace. And we've said that before 9/11 and after 9/11. We've been arguing that democracy promotion is the wrong goal. It's an illegitimate, immoral goal. So we were critics of Bush's policy throughout his term. And since then, we've been advocating that what's needed is an understanding of the enemy's nature. And part of seeing what that is, the Islamist movement, is seeing where Iran fits in as one of the key parts of that. And as we've been arguing, Iran needs to be a focus, and it hasn't been. So there's another critique. Now people are worried about Iran, and rightly, because it's being left neglected.
Right. So you mentioned Bush. Conservatives, if you listen to conservatives, will say the Bush doctrine was a success and Obama is making a mess of things. What's your reaction?
Well, if you judge Obama relative to Bush, Bush comes out looking like a giant, looking like John Wayne. But you can't judge it that way. I mean, you have to judge it relative to what should we have been doing. And that is defending ourselves rather than going around spreading democracy. And I think if you judge Bush, and specifically the doctrine of the surge, which was supposedly what turned Iraq around, it failed. And it failed even as it was being celebrated as a success at the end of Bush's term. So at best, this is myopia or amnesia. And at worst, it's dishonest, because Bush was really bad. Obama's bad too. But we don't get very far by comparing the two. We need to see what should be the ideal here.
Now, as you mentioned before, that's not a military failure of the surge or our approach in the Middle East, but elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, so this is the irony, one of the many ironies. America is, without dispute, the most powerful military force, not just today, but ever in world history, as far as we can tell, both in the sophistication of its weapons and the scale. Now, that poses a question. How is it that we went into Afghanistan and Iraq, and Afghanistan is the longest war America has ever fought, against people with secondhand guns, beat-up pickup trucks, and barely even the kind of technology that our troops carry. Not even close. How is that possible? Well, it's possible, and it's a result of our having ideas that cripple our military, that hold them back, rein them in, and in effect tell our soldiers not to fight to win.
All right, so I would like to now jump to an entirely different part of the Middle East, one that we've talked about before in these interviews, which is Israel. Israel now is at war with Hamas again. Does that have any connection to our broader policy in the Middle East and to anything that's happened after 9/11? Is it just sui generis?
Yeah, I think it's useful to see the connections. One is the Islamist movement, which we felt the full force of 9/11 and since then, is enormous. It's not just Al-Qaeda. It is Hamas and Hezbollah and a lot of the groups that they've been around for a long time. Hamas is now the chief adversary in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And that is understandable if you see the broader trends, which is the Middle East has been seen the rise of Islamists for decades. And Hamas is another indicator of that. It tracks that trend. So in effect, the Israel-Palestinian conflict is a small-scale version of the West versus the Islamist movement. Now, the second and more concrete example of the way these are connected is under the Bush doctrine of bringing democracy all over the place, the Palestinian territories were subject to that, and the Bush administration pushed for Hamas to be allowed to run in elections.
Right.
And Hamas, in fact, won by a significant margin, enough for it to be unequivocal. And it was a free and fair election. We have testimony to this. So in effect, the Bush doctrine here is illustrated in its failure in ushering Islamists into power. So both in the trend of how Islamists are rising as a result of cultural phenomena and people's embrace of them, and then electorally, when America brings in the ballot boxes, they come in too.
So much for the wonders of democracy. All right, I don't want to end on too bleak a note, if we can. I don't know, things look pretty bad to me in the Middle East, but is there a silver lining? Is there anything good that our viewers can take away from, I don't know, whatever we've learned or what's happening?
I think if you look at the last 13 plus years in the Middle East, we have enough evidence now that people can say, well, look at what we've tried. We've tried Bush's doctrine, and that failed. And we've seen developments like the Arab Spring, and we've seen the euphoria, which was short-lived around that. We have evidence of what the region really means and what it stands for, what people believe, and what are the trends. So there's now more evidence of what is going on. And if we're serious about advancing U.S. security, we're in a better position. There's less excuse, in another way to put it, for believing things that are not true. A lot of the Bush doctrine has been, the assumptions of it have been refuted. Bush's policies have been shown to be failed, and so have Obama's assumptions about the Middle East have been exposed. So now the air is cleared in a certain way, and the rise of ISIS provides a naked example of this. This is the face of the enemy, unvarnished, unexcused. And now we're in a better position, I think, and this is really stretching if you want the silver lining. We're in a position where it's a lot harder to claim that the enemy is something other than what it is, and that we need more democracy, and that is not what we need. We need to be frank and honest with ourselves and look at the facts. And if we do that, we're in a better position to advance the principle that needs to be put into place, which is we need to be self-interested. We've tried the altruistic path. That was Bush on steroids. And we've tried Obama, which was a variation of that. And neither of those brings us success. Well, now let's try something that really advances our interests. Let's understand what that looks like. What is egoism in foreign policy? It is not Bush. Let's really understand what it looks like.
So something to be learned if we really want to learn the lessons. All right, thanks a lot, Elan.